The dungeon with no light for years. Beneath the looming towers of Lancaster Castle, carved into the ancient stone, lies a place where sunlight has never been permitted to enter. For centuries, a secret world existed just below the feet of the living, a world reserved for those society wished to forget. Here, in the dungeon with no light, men and women were lowered into an abyss so absolute that the boundaries between day and night, dream and reality, hope and despair, blurred and finally vanished. This is not a tale of legend. It is a historical fact, documented in the crumbling records of English justice and whispered in the folklore of a town that has tried for generations to forget the horrors hidden beneath its castle walls. Imagine for a moment what it means to enter a space of total darkness. Not the darkness of a moonless night, where starlight glimmers at the edge of your sight, or the darkness behind closed eyes when sleep begins to claim you. This is a darkness so complete, so suffocating, that your own hand before your face becomes nothing but memory. The air itself tastes thick and stale, every breath brings a tang of stone, rot, and bodies stacked in a place meant not for the living, but for the condemned. In Lancaster Castle, the dungeon was not a room, it was a sentence. For the unlucky souls dragged through its iron doors, life itself unraveled in endless night. In the late Middle Ages and beyond, justice was not measured by fairness, but by fear. To be accused, often without proof, sometimes merely by rumor or the anger of a powerful neighbor, was enough to doom you to the castle's deep cells. These dungeons were built for one purpose: to break the spirit. Prisoners were often shackled to the wall or thrown onto damp straw, forced to share space with rats and the dying. No candle was allowed. No shaft of sunlight was permitted to fall. For weeks, months, and sometimes years, men and women sat in darkness so profound that the mind itself began to fray. The records are chillingly clear. Testimonies from rare survivors or from the jailers who dared to look inside speak of prisoners who, after weeks without light, forgot the color of their own skin. Their eyes grew wide, then blank. The mind, deprived of all external cues, soon turned inward, feeding on fear, memory, and hallucination. Some prisoners talked to people who weren't there. Others screamed in terror at shapes only they could see. The darkness was not empty. It was filled with monsters of the mind. There are accounts of prisoners going blind, literally. The human eye is a miraculous thing, built to adapt to changing light, but in utter darkness the machinery of sight falters. Some prisoners developed an agonizing condition where the eye, starved of stimulation, began to break down. Eyelids fused shut, the surface of the eye ulcerated, and blindness became permanent. Yet the loss of sight was often the least of their suffering. The mind, desperate for any sensory input, began to fill the void with phantoms. Imagine spending months unable to distinguish dream from reality, haunted by the voices of your own fears. Disease was a constant companion. The dungeon air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, urine, and decay. Many prisoners died from fever, starvation, or wounds inflicted either by others or by their own hands in the throes of madness. In a world without light, infection spread unchecked. The dungeon became both tomb and torture chamber, a place where justice was abandoned in favor of slow, anonymous annihilation. And yet, perhaps the most haunting legacy of Lancaster's dungeon is not the death it delivered, but the knowledge that most of those sent below were never tried or convicted in any way modern minds would recognize as fair. In the 17th and 18th centuries, England's criminal justice system was brutal but often arbitrary. To be suspected of theft, witchcraft, rebellion, or even mere association with an enemy of the state could see you thrown into the darkness, awaiting a trial that might never come. Some prisoners were forgotten entirely, dying nameless and unrecorded, their only crime being inconvenient existence. The cell became a limbo, neither punishment nor mercy, just an absence of everything that made life human. Imagine for a moment what hope means in a place without time. When there is no dawn, the mind loses all sense of hours or days. Some prisoners tried to mark time by scratching the stone, counting heartbeats, or reciting prayers. But as weeks blurred into months, memory faded. The sense of self eroded until nothing remained but the awareness of pain and the absence of light. In that abyss, some prisoners sang to themselves, songs from childhood or hymns half remembered, just to prove they were still alive. Some stopped speaking altogether, their voices stolen by despair. Occasionally, the sound of a jailer's footsteps above or the distant drip of water was all that connected them to a world that had decided they were better off erased. If you travel to Lancaster Castle today, you can descend a stone staircase, cold and worn by centuries of fearful feet, and step into the very darkness that once swallowed hundreds. The air is still heavy with the memory of suffering. Tour guides sometimes ask visitors to extinguish their torches and stand in silence for a moment. The darkness rushes in, dense and immediate, pressing against your skin. It is said that in those seconds, even modern visitors feel panic rising. Some clutch at friends, some gasp for breath, some flee the room. For the prisoners of Lancaster, there was no escape, no comfort, and no end but death. Why did such cruelty persist? In an age before human rights, before any concept of rehabilitation or dignity for the accused, the dungeon was the physical expression of power. It was a warning, visible only to those who were brought low enough to see it. It was a tool not just of punishment, but of erasure. The darkness was a verdict: you do not exist. And if you should somehow survive, you will never be the same. The world you return to, if you return at all, will be brighter than you can bear, yet emptier than you remember. For the dungeon does not just kill the body. It murders time, self, and memory. The story of the dungeon with no light is not a distant echo. It is a reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and cruelty, between justice and vengeance. The stone walls of Lancaster Castle still stand, their foundations soaked in the terror of those who vanished beneath them. To remember these forgotten prisoners is not just an act of historical curiosity, it is a warning. The darkness is always waiting just below the surface, and the silence of those lost in the abyss still lingers, whispering through the stones, asking if the world above truly remembers or cares. Somewhere, deep beneath the laughter of tourists and the sunlight in the castle courtyard, the memory of darkness persists. It is not a story with a happy ending. It is instead a lesson written in shadow, urging us to never again forget those left in the dark. The chains that grew into flesh. Of all the horrors whispered by the stones of the Tower of London, few are as viscerally haunting as the fate of those whose chains were never removed. In the deep, damp underbelly of the tower centuries ago, iron restraints were not a temporary punishment. For many prisoners, they became an extension of the body itself, a sentence that was not just psychological torment, but a slow physical transformation, where metal and flesh fused over time. The records of the tower hold countless stories of political prisoners, religious dissenters, accused traitors, men and women forgotten by history, reduced to little more than cautionary tales or footnotes in royal decrees. Yet it is in these forgotten cells, in the darkest hours of endless captivity, that a different kind of history unfolded. Not the grand dramas of kings and crowns, but the unrelenting intimate horror of the body itself betraying its own boundaries. Imagine the process. The initial moment when the iron manacles were locked onto a wrist or ankle, the cold bite of metal against skin, the echo of the key turning, signaling the loss of agency. At first, the body resists. Skin grows raw, blisters form, bruises darken the flesh. But weeks turn to months, months to years. The iron meant to restrain now begins to invade. Rust develops in the humid air, corroding both metal and flesh, eating away at the skin until the boundary blurs. The body's attempts at healing, swelling, scarring, granulation, only make the situation more grotesque. Flesh starts to grow around the metal, enveloping it. The chain, once alien, is now embedded, an unremovable parasite. Any movement, an attempt to stretch, a shift in posture, tears open the wounds anew, causing infection, pus, and agony beyond words. The metal becomes part of the person's anatomy, bone and iron locked together by the slow violence of time. There are documented accounts from jailers and visitors that describe prisoners with iron rings so fused into their limbs that removal would mean mutilation, perhaps even death. Chroniclers of the Tudor and Stuart eras wrote of men whose wrists seemed swallowed by the iron, whose ankles were bloated and suppurating, the chain hidden beneath rotten bandages and leaking wounds. In these accounts, the chains are no longer mere tools of imprisonment. They become symbols of ultimate power, a power that extends beneath the skin, asserting ownership over the very fabric of a human being. Medical knowledge at the time was primitive. Infection was a death sentence. The tower's dungeons were wet, rank, and crawling with vermin. Cuts quickly turned septic. Prisoners might scratch at their sores, desperate to loosen the grip of the chain, only to drive the rust deeper. Fever, delirium, the stench of rot, all became constant companions. Sometimes the body's immune response went wild, attempting to wall off the foreign iron, causing abscesses and necrosis. Fingers and toes blackened and fell away. The line between pain and existence vanished. Many prisoners died not from the original charge, but from the slow, inevitable poisoning of their own bodies by metal, infection, and hopelessness. It's important to remember this was not always the fate of high-born captives. Nobles might win leniency, lighter fetters, or even the removal of chains at night. But the poor, the accused spies, the failed rebels, they received no mercy. Their suffering was meant to be instructive, a warning etched in living flesh to anyone who might dare question the authority of the state. To the authorities, a chain that grew into flesh was not merely neglect, it was a message. This is what happens when you defy the crown. This is the price of disobedience, inscribed not in law, but in wounds that never healed. Now try to picture the psychological weight of such imprisonment. Each day begins and ends with the same unrelenting ache. Sleep becomes impossible. Any change in position tugs the embedded metal, sending lances of pain through the body. The prisoner begins to hallucinate, fever dreams swirling with memories of freedom, loved ones, or a time before pain became the axis of existence. Conversations with fellow captives become slurred, desperate. Some attempt to bargain with the jailers, offering information, confessions, bribes, anything just for the relief of having the iron removed. But in most cases, the answer is silence or laughter. The guards have seen this all before. Suffering to them is part of the scenery. Occasionally, a visitor, a priest, a lawyer, a sympathetic noble, would be allowed to witness the state of the prisoners. Some left accounts so graphic they still make the modern reader flinch. One tells of a man whose wrists were twice their normal size, the iron buried so deep it was invisible beneath swollen tissue. Another describes the sound of iron grinding on bone as a prisoner tried to shift his weight during prayer. These details were sometimes used to plead for mercy, to petition for release or medical attention, but such pleas were rarely granted. The state believed that pain purified, that agony was an appropriate prelude to confession, repentance, or the scaffold. For some, the chains would never be removed, not even in death. Bodies were buried with the iron still fused to their bones, the ultimate mark of a life stolen by power. This phenomenon was not unique to the Tower of London. Across Europe, in castles and fortresses, similar horrors unfolded. But the Tower, with its cold river mists, its echoing corridors, and its reputation as a place of inescapable doom, became a symbol of suffering so profound that it changed the very meaning of captivity. The prisoner's experience became more than just loss of freedom. It became the slow, unstoppable invasion of the self by something alien, something designed to erase dignity and reduce a person to an object. There's a strange, almost mythic dimension to the image of a chain grown into flesh. It blurs the line between victim and punishment, between man and machine. In some ways, it prefigures the modern fear of losing oneself to the systems meant to control us, of becoming something less than human, defined entirely by our restraints. But in the medieval tower, this was not a metaphor. It was a physical, daily reality. Every wound, every suppurating sore, every feverish hallucination was a reminder that the body itself had become a battleground between hope and despair, between resistance and surrender. Yet, amid the horror, there are glimmers of defiance. Some prisoners found ways to subvert their agony by turning their chains into symbols of martyrdom, by using the iron as tools to etch messages into the walls, by composing prayers or poetry in their darkest hours. In rare cases, these acts of resistance were discovered centuries later, carved into the stonework, reminders that even when the body was invaded, the mind could still rebel. The chains may have grown into flesh, but the will to endure, to be witnessed, to leave a mark, survived. When we walk the halls of the tower today, we see the relics: iron rings bolted into walls, manacles in glass cases, graffiti etched by desperate hands. But the real story lies beneath the surface, in the silent testimony of bones unearthed with metal still encircling them, in the invisible scars left on history itself. To imagine what it was like is to confront the limits of empathy, to recognize how power can distort the very definition of humanity. This is not just a story about punishment. It is a meditation on suffering, survival, and the monstrous ingenuity of systems designed to break the spirit. So, the next time you see an old iron chain, consider its history. Was it merely a tool, a symbol, or did it once become something far more intimate and horrifying? In the Tower of London, for some, the answer was written in blood, rust, and the slow merging of iron and flesh, a nightmare so real it still lingers in the shadows of those ancient, unyielding walls. The scream hole that haunted the guards. You would not have noticed it if you were just passing through the winding corridors of a medieval fortress. The torchlight flickers on damp, uneven stone. Somewhere, a draft whispers through an opening so small it seems part of the ancient wall's decay. But that little slit in the stone has a purpose. In some castles, they called it a scream hole, a vent, nothing more than a hand's width across, cut high in the walls of the deepest dungeons. And through this vent, the misery of the condemned would bleed into every corner of the castle above, like a poison gas you could never see but could always feel. It is a detail almost lost to history. But in the castles of Europe, particularly in places like the Tower of London, Chillon Castle in Switzerland, or the fortress prisons of France and Italy, these holes became infamous not only for their impact on the prisoners below, but on the guards, those meant to be the masters of this world, who instead became its second set of victims. Imagine you are a guard, assigned the graveyard shift, standing watch in an otherwise empty hallway just above the dungeon. At first it is the chill you notice, the kind that never leaves your bones, no matter how many winters you've survived. But then, in the depth of night, you hear it, a cry, distant but piercing, twisting up from the stone floor. It doesn't sound like an animal, but neither does it sound fully human. Sometimes it is a desperate plea, sometimes just a ragged, endless moan. Sometimes it is laughter, high, broken, and unhinged, echoing through the darkness. These are not stories invented by writers. Accounts from medieval records and later writings by guards, prisoners, and visiting officials detail these phenomena again and again. The architecture itself created an acoustic chamber. Sound would travel up through these holes, the cries amplified by the narrow stone shafts, bouncing and swirling until it felt like they were everywhere, inescapable, living things. The official explanation for the scream hole was ventilation. In truth, dungeons were cramped, disease-ridden, and poorly ventilated. Some prisoners, packed in like animals, would have suffocated without some way for fresh air to circulate. But it was no accident that these holes were left open to the castle above, that they were often positioned in places where the guards' posts stood nearby. In some cases, the design was deliberate, a form of psychological warfare, not just on the prisoners, but on everyone who served the system. When prisoners were tortured, the stone acted like a megaphone. The screams echoed, merged, became a permanent part of the fortress. Guards would talk about the noise that gets inside your head. Medieval chroniclers wrote of castle staff breaking down, refusing to serve in certain wings. Some guards were reassigned or dismissed for becoming unsound of mind. Consider the case of Shillong Castle, where prisoners carved graffiti into the stone, some of it detailing the endless noise, the sense that you were never alone. In the Tower of London, there are accounts from the Tudor period of guards reporting nightmares, hallucinations, even paranoia, insisting that the cries did not stop even after the prisoners had died. There are rumors, never proven, that some guards threw themselves from the battlements rather than face another night's duty above the scream hole. Other castles, like those in rural France, have records of monks called to exorcise the noise, believing it to be the work of demons, not desperate men. It was more than just haunting. It became a tool of discipline. For the guards, the constant agony was a warning. This is what awaits anyone who crosses the line. There is a dark genius in how this infected even the authority figures with a sense of dread, as if the cruelty of the dungeon could not be contained, but would inevitably leak out, staining the souls of everyone above. Sometimes the prisoners would scream in rhythm, forming an unintentional chorus. Sometimes the torture was public, the holes placed so the cries would rise during mealtime, a reminder to everyone of the power the lords wielded. Occasionally, the guards would try to block the holes with rags or wood, only to find that the sound found new ways to escape, carried on the wind, seeping out between cracks and corners, invading sleep and sanity alike. It's important to understand that not every castle had a scream hole, and not every prison was built with this feature in mind. But in those that did, the legend spread quickly, far beyond the walls themselves. The psychological effect was contagious. Even in castles without a literal scream hole, guards would imagine they heard voices, footsteps, the scraping of chains in empty halls. The idea infected the imagination of a continent. Why did it drive people mad? The answer lies in the architecture of the human mind as much as the stones themselves. Guards, often poorly paid and of low social status, lived in constant fear, not just of rebellion or escape, but of the moral rot that came from enforcing cruelty as a job. Many were former soldiers, already wounded by war, already haunted by memories. The scream hole was like a funnel, focusing all the pain and terror of the dungeons into a single endless moment, replayed night after night. Over time, the boundaries between the suffering of the prisoner and the mind of the guard began to blur. It was not uncommon for guards to report hearing screams even when the cells were empty, or for families of guards to speak of their loved ones growing cold, withdrawn, or violent. One medieval record from France describes a man who could not bear the night, who saw specters in every shadow and trembled at the sound of the wind. Another from England tells of a guard who covered his ears with wax but still woke screaming. It is easy to think of history as a story of kings and armies, of power and rebellion. But in the echo of a scream hole you hear a different story, one of ordinary people, twisted by the systems they serve, trapped in cycles of cruelty that destroy both victim and enforcer. The castles themselves become haunted, not by ghosts, but by the residue of real human agony, reverberating through stone. Some castles today still echo if you walk the lower halls. Tourists say the air feels heavy, or that they hear whispers when the wind blows just right. Maybe it is nothing, or maybe, centuries later, the walls still remember. The scream hole is a small thing, an architectural detail, but it is also a portal, a doorway through which pain, fear, and madness can travel, touching everyone who comes near. In this way, the dungeon infects the castle, and the castle infects the world above. History is written in the stones, yes, but in places like these, it is also screamed into them forever, a sound that never quite fades. And as you stand in the silence of some forgotten castle centuries later, you realize some places are not haunted by the dead, but by the screams of the living, screams that echo through time, through stone, and through the minds of all who ever listened, whether they wanted to or not. The cell, so small you couldn't lie down. In the shadowed depths of medieval prisons, some of the cruelest punishments were not physical blows or weapons, but the very architecture itself. Among the darkest corners of Norwich Castle, a grim device of psychological and physical torment was hidden, An infamous cell known as the Little Ease. Its name alone hints at its merciless design. A prison so small that no prisoner could find any comfort. Not enough space to stand upright, not enough room to sit, and far too confined even to lie down. This was a chamber deliberately crafted to strip a person of all basic physical ease, forcing a relentless battle against the body and mind. The concept of little ease was not unique to Norwich Castle. Similar cells existed in various medieval fortresses and dungeons across England and Europe. However, the one in Norwich is among the most notorious due to the castle's long documented history as a royal fortress, prison, and site of severe punishment. Built originally as a Norman stronghold in the 11th century, Norwich Castle's dungeons evolved into places of terror, designed to break prisoners through a systematic application of confinement and deprivation. The Little Ease was the epitome of this cruel ingenuity. Imagine being locked inside a space barely larger than your own body. A stone chamber roughly 2 feet wide and barely tall enough to allow any meaningful movement. Prisoners confined here could not sit comfortably. There was no bench or ledge to rest upon. They could not stand fully upright, as the ceiling was far too low. And to lie down was impossible due to the cramped dimensions. The human body, forced into a permanent state of discomfort, became an instrument of its own suffering. The name Little Ease cruelly mocks the absence of any relief. Such confinement inflicted devastating consequences. Physically, prisoners endured constant muscle cramps, joint pain, and pressure sores. The inability to shift position meant that blood circulation would be impaired and the skeletal system strained unnaturally. Over time, this led to progressive physical deterioration. But the agony did not stop with the body. Mental torment compounded the misery. With no space to stretch, no ability to rest, and often little light or air, prisoners faced sensory deprivation that quickly spiraled into despair, confusion, and madness. Historical records, although sparse and often obscured by the fog of time, reveal some harrowing accounts of the Little Ease and its effects. Chroniclers from the medieval period wrote of prisoners losing their sanity, babbling incoherently, or succumbing to despair after prolonged stays. While the official use of such cells was not widespread due to their extreme nature, they served as a dreaded threat, sometimes used for high-profile prisoners or those accused of the gravest offenses. The mere knowledge that such a punishment awaited could break spirits before the sentence was even carried out. Norwich Castle's Little Ease exemplifies the medieval philosophy of punishment, an intertwining of physical pain and psychological terror. Torture was not always about the infliction of visible wounds. It was often about eroding the prisoner's sense of self, their ability to maintain hope or dignity. The body, trapped in an unyielding stone coffin, became a prison for the mind as well. Time in such a cell stretched endlessly with no distinction between day and night, sanity and madness. Every moment became a test of endurance against a relentless enemy, the cell itself. The architecture of Little Ease was a silent but cruel accomplice in this punishment. Constructed with rough, cold stone walls, the cell absorbed the chill of the damp castle dungeons, making it an environment hostile to human life. Its cramped dimensions left no space for basic necessities. Food and water were often passed through narrow openings or delivered with minimal contact. The prisoner's only company was the oppressive silence, or at times, the distant echoes of footsteps and moans within the fortress walls. Interestingly, the existence of such cells reflects the medieval legal system's complex relationship with incarceration and punishment. Unlike modern prisons focused on rehabilitation, medieval dungeons were tools of humiliation, control, and terror. The law was enforced not only through execution, but also through psychological destruction. The Little Ease stands as a brutal reminder of this era's harsh realities, where human rights were virtually non-existent and cruelty was institutionalized. Modern visitors to Norwich Castle can still glimpse the remnants of this dark legacy. Though many of the original dungeon structures have been altered or lost, historians and archaeologists have pieced together the layout and function of these torturous spaces. The little ease is remembered not just as a physical cell, but as a symbol of a system that used spatial confinement as a weapon. It prompts us to reflect on how architecture can become a tool of oppression and how extreme deprivation affects the human spirit. Moreover, the little ease challenges us to consider the boundaries of human endurance and the psychological impact of confinement. Today, scientific studies on solitary confinement and sensory deprivation echo the medieval experiences, demonstrating how extreme isolation and cramped conditions can induce hallucinations, anxiety, depression, and irreversible mental damage. The medieval little ease was, in a grim way, an early experiment in the destructive power of space itself. In exploring the history of the little ease at Norwich Castle, we confront a sobering chapter of human cruelty masked by stone and silence. It reveals how punishment can transcend physical pain to invade the very essence of our humanity. The cell, so small you could not lie down, was designed to dismantle the prisoner's body and mind, piece by agonizing piece. It is a testament to a time when cruelty was crafted not only through instruments of torture, but through the deliberate manipulation of space and the denial of comfort. As we delve deeper into this dark history, the little ease invites us to remember those who suffered unseen, whose torment was written not in scars, but in broken spirits and shattered minds. It compels us to recognize the importance of human dignity and the profound damage inflicted when it is stripped away. The story of this cell remains a chilling reminder of how architecture can imprison not only bodies, but souls, echoing through the ages as a silent witness to the darkest aspects of human justice. The legacy of the little ease endures as a stark warning. It warns us of the dangers in designing punishment that disregards the holistic nature of human suffering. In remembering these cramped stone walls and the prisoners who endured them, we affirm our commitment to justice that respects humanity, to laws that heal rather than destroy, and to societies that guard against the slow, crushing confinement of the spirit. Thus, the cell so small you could not lie down stands as a haunting symbol, etched in the stones of Norwich Castle and in the shadowed corridors of history, a place where the absence of ease was the most potent form of torture imaginable. The man who ate rats to survive. Beneath the black stone arches of Newgate Prison, London, where the city's rot collected in human form, survival was an act of rebellion. In this ancient fortress of misery, hope rotted as fast as flesh. No fire burned in those cells, no comfort, and for most, no future. But among the shadows, a story emerged, stranger and more primal than the nightmares that haunted its walls. The story of a man who, faced with death by slow starvation, made a pact with desperation and began eating the very creatures that haunted his sleep, the rats of Newgate. His name has been half forgotten by history, sometimes whispered as John, sometimes as William. But his act was never forgotten. This man, thrown into Newgate for a petty crime, found himself condemned to a cell so damp that moss grew on the walls, where straw bedding molded under leaking sewage and the cold chewed his bones. In the late 1700s, Newgate was less a prison and more a human warehouse. Hundreds packed into cells, food rations so meager they amounted to a handful of moldy bread and foul water, sometimes nothing for days. Disease ran through these stone veins, typhus, jail fever, consumption, killing as reliably as the hangman's rope. He watched men die around him. Some wasted to skeletons, eyes sunk, skin stretched tight and gray. Others went mad with hunger, gnawing at wood, chewing leather belts, or fighting over a scrap of carrot dropped by a jailer. Food was currency, and starvation, the law. In that world, hunger did not sharpen the senses. It blunted everything except fear. Yet this man was determined to live. He studied the rats that crept in after dusk, an endless tide of bold, black-eyed scavengers. To others, the rats were terror, plague-bringers, thieves in the night, who gnawed at flesh and hope. But to him, they were something else. They were survival. No one knows the exact moment he crossed the line. The first night he reached into the shadows, seized a rat by the tail, and killed it with trembling hands. Imagine the silence, the whispered disgust from fellow prisoners, the flicker of horror on the jailer's face. Yet hunger was a teacher that killed all shame. The first bite, raw and wild, must have tasted like defiance and like hell. The skin was tough, the meat stringy, the blood metallic. But it was food, and in Newgate, food was a miracle. The guards watched with a mixture of horror and respect. Some thought him mad, some called him a demon. But as the weeks bled into months and months into years, something stranger unfolded. Others died, their bodies carried out, nameless and unremarked. But this man endured. When questioned, he told the truth. He survived by eating what others could not bear to even touch. He caught rats, killed them cleanly, ate them raw. He did not cook them. There was no fire, no means. He ate them whole, often in the dark, using only his teeth and the blunt tools of hunger. Why did he live? Was it something in the rats themselves, protein, fat, blood, enough to keep a man's organs working when everything else failed? Or was it willpower, a psychological edge over death, a refusal to let fate dictate his end? For 4 years he outlasted the strongest men, 4 years after he should have died. The records show that he looked almost spectral, skin pale, eyes bright with a feverish light, hands gnarled and scarred by bites. But he was alive. The act of eating rats was more than survival. It was a rebellion against a system designed to erase the unwanted. The prison system in 18th century London was not meant to rehabilitate. It was meant to punish and destroy. Food deprivation was a tool of control. Starving prisoners made them weaker, easier to subdue, less likely to escape or riot. In this context, eating rats became a kind of subversive ritual, taking from the walls what the state denied, turning revulsion into nourishment. Historians have debated the truth of the tale, but court documents, memoirs from Newgate, and even medical examiners' reports support the basic facts. The man's health was terrible. He suffered fevers, sores, and nightmares. Yet compared to those who ate only prison rations, he was almost robust. Some jailers eventually stopped punishing him. They even began to toss live rats into his cell, half out of cruelty, half out of morbid curiosity. He accepted them, killed and ate, and survived. The social reaction to his story was divided. For the upper classes, the tale was a symbol of how low a human could fall. For reformers and early prison activists, it was proof of the brutality of the English penal system. Charles Dickens, who visited Newgate and described its horrors, used stories like these to push for change. To the common folk, it became a kind of dark legend, a whisper about the will to live at any cost. There is something almost mythic about the act. The rat, symbol of plague and decay, becomes bread. The prisoner, symbol of society's failure, becomes a survivor. In those 4 years, this man's story asked a question. What would you do to live when all dignity, comfort, and hope are stripped away? Is there a point where hunger becomes more powerful than disgust, where survival is the only morality? His story spread beyond Newgate. For decades after, the phrase "eating rats to survive" became a metaphor in England for enduring the impossible. In later prison riots, in wartime bunkers, in sieges and famines, men and women remembered, the body will do what it must, and the mind will justify anything when life is on the line. Modern science now looks back with a kind of grim fascination. Raw rat flesh is not safe. Parasites, disease, and infection are risks. Yet compared to starvation, it was a calculated gamble. The human body, starved for protein and fat, will begin to digest its own muscles, organs, even the heart. But a few bites of animal flesh, no matter how filthy, can reset that fatal clock. In the end, he did not escape. He died in his cell, like so many others, years after his expected death date. But he died having defied the system that sought to erase him. His body was buried in a nameless grave, but his legend survived. In court records, in the horrified recollections of those who witnessed, and in the myths passed from one prisoner generation to the next. Today, the old stones of Newgate are gone, swept away by progress, their secrets buried beneath London's rush. But in the darkness where the past lingers, the memory of the man who ate rats to survive still gnaws at the conscience of history. What are we when stripped of comfort, dignity, and choice? What strange acts might any of us commit if left alone with nothing but hunger and the will to live? The answers, echoing from the depths of Newgate, are never as distant as we imagine. The torture chair that never stopped dripping. There are relics of history that speak not through words, but through the silence of their presence. The cold touch of iron, the worn grooves of stone, the lingering stains that time refuses to erase. Deep within the ancient walls of Warwick Castle lies one such relic, the infamous iron torture chair. It is not just a piece of medieval cruelty, but a symbol of a justice system built on fear, suffering, and the slow unraveling of human endurance. This chair, etched in history for the brutal way it was used, did not merely hold prisoners. It was a device designed to bleed them slowly, to extend agony across hours and days until body and spirit broke together. The blood that dripped from its iron spikes pooled into a gutter carved into the cold stone floor, a continuous, haunting reminder of lives squeezed dry by pain. To understand the horror of the torture chair at Warwick Castle, we must step back into a world where justice was synonymous with spectacle and terror. In medieval England, castles were more than fortresses. They were seats of absolute power. Lords ruled with iron fists, backed by the church, and their courts often lacked the fairness or due process we expect today. Accused individuals, whether criminals, rebels, or simply those who had fallen out of favor, were subjected to tortures designed as much to humiliate and terrorize as to extract confessions or punish crimes. The iron chair was a centerpiece of such cruelty. Constructed entirely from cold, unyielding metal, the chair was embedded with dozens of sharp spikes meticulously positioned to pierce the flesh without causing immediate death. The spikes were arranged to maximize pain on the seat, the armrests, the back, and even under the feet. When a prisoner was forced onto the chair and strapped down tightly, the spikes punctured their skin, tearing muscles and veins slowly and systematically. What made this chair particularly horrific was the deliberate prolonging of suffering. Unlike executions or more sudden forms of torture, the iron chair's design was to bleed the captive slowly. Blood would seep, drip, and pool steadily, marking the passage of time in a grim physical way. Beneath the chair, the floor was not flat. It was grooved to channel the blood into a gutter carved deep into the stone, where it would flow away silently but relentlessly. Accounts from the era mention how the blood dripping continued long after the prisoner fainted, passed out from shock, or even died. The drip, drip, drip became a dreadful rhythm, echoing through the cold chambers, a mournful clock that measured human agony. This method of torture was more than a physical punishment. It was psychological warfare. The prisoner, immobilized and helpless, was forced to confront their own vulnerability hour after hour, with no escape from the pain or the sound of their own bleeding. The slow agony eroded not only the body, but the mind. Histories tell of victims whose minds unraveled under the unending torment, hallucinations, delirium, and despair taking hold as their senses were overwhelmed by pain and the omnipresent sound of dripping blood. Torture in medieval England often had a grim dual purpose, punishment and confession. The iron chair was employed to extract information, names of conspirators, stolen goods, secret plots, or to break those who defied authority. Yet it was also a method of control, a stark warning to others of the consequences of disobedience. The spectacle of the chair was meant to be known, its fear spreading far beyond the cold stone walls of Warwick Castle. The use of the iron chair spanned centuries. Its presence in Warwick Castle's dungeons reminds us that cruelty was institutionalized and normalized. This was a world where mercy was rare and where power was maintained through terror. The chair was not reserved for the worst criminals alone. Political prisoners, dissenters, and innocent victims caught in the tides of shifting alliances often faced its torment. The laws themselves were harsh and arbitrary, and torture was legally sanctioned in many cases as a tool of governance. Understanding the chair's place in history also means acknowledging the human cost behind the bloodstains. Each drip in the gutter beneath the chair represents a life slowly extinguished, a body forced beyond its limits, and a spirit battered by relentless pain. Survivors of such tortures were few and forever changed. Many died forgotten, their names lost to time, their stories reduced to grim footnotes in dusty archives. Yet their suffering is etched into the very fabric of the castle. Today, Warwick Castle stands as a monument to centuries of history, its towering walls and grand halls filled with tales of bravery and power. But beneath its grandeur lies the shadow of the iron torture chair, a stark reminder of a past where justice was a tool of terror and where human cruelty was systematized. Visitors who descend into the castle's dungeons are sometimes asked to pause and imagine the unbearable pain once endured in these cold chambers, to hear the imagined drip of blood on stone, and to reflect on how far humanity has come and how far it must still go. The iron torture chair that never stopped dripping is more than a gruesome artifact. It is a symbol of the depths of suffering inflicted by unchecked power, a testament to resilience, and a warning etched in blood. To remember it is to confront the darkest aspects of justice and humanity, to honor those who endured unimaginable pain, and to vow never to allow such cruelty to take root again. In the end, the story of the chair is a story about time, pain, and memory. The slow drip of blood was a cruel measure of passing moments, a brutal clock that marked the endlessness of suffering. Yet it also echoes across centuries, urging us to remember, to learn, and to ensure that the horrors once hidden in the shadows of Warwick Castle's dungeons remain forever in the light. When dungeon water turned black with disease. Beneath the ancient city of York lies a history both grim and haunting, a story that reveals the darkest depths of human suffering hidden within stone walls and iron bars. In the medieval and early modern periods, dungeons were not mere holding cells, but places where misery was compounded by neglect, where the boundaries between life and death blurred in silence. Among the most harrowing truths is the tale of the dungeon water that turned black with disease, a silent, invisible killer that claimed more lives than the lash or the executioner's blade. Prisoners confined in York's dungeons faced horrors beyond their crimes. The cells, carved deep beneath the city and often situated near or below the water table, trapped stagnant pools of water that seeped through the stone floors and walls. This water was not fresh or clean. It was a toxic stew, dark, foul, and teeming with decay. Over time, these pools became contaminated with human waste, scraps of rotting food, dead rats, and even the decomposing bodies of prisoners who perished within the walls. The dungeon's environment was a perfect breeding ground for disease, a moist, dark, and crowded space where sanitation was non-existent, and hope even more so. The prisoners had no choice but to drink from these pools to survive. Water is life, but in York's dungeons it became a slow sentence to death. The water was often described as thick and black, shimmering with an oily sheen, carrying the stench of rot and filth. Drinking it meant ingesting the unseen horrors that lurked within, bacteria, parasites, and the vectors of deadly diseases. Among these diseases, typhus, then known as jail fever, was the most feared and fatal. Typhus is a disease spread by lice and fleas, but in the filth and squalor of the dungeons, it thrived with ruthless efficiency. The crowded, filthy conditions allowed the lice to multiply rapidly, jumping from person to person. Once infected, a prisoner would suffer intense fever, severe headaches, chills, and a rash spreading across the body. Delirium, bleeding, and often death followed within days or weeks. Typhus was a scourge not only for prisoners, but also for the guards and officials who came into contact with the sick. Records from York show that outbreaks of jail fever in the dungeons sometimes caused entire courtrooms to fall ill after trials, spreading the disease beyond the prison walls and into the wider community. The grim reality of dungeon life was such that more prisoners died from typhus and other diseases than from torture or execution. The physical torment of confinement was eclipsed by the slow, merciless advance of infection. Bodies decomposed in the cells, contaminating the water and air, creating a cycle of death and decay. There was no relief, no escape. The prisoners' cries for clean water or better conditions were met with indifference or cruelty. Disease became the de facto executioner, carrying out a judgment not written in law but in the corrosive chemistry of neglect. Historical accounts from the time provide chilling glimpses into this reality. One magistrate who inspected the dungeons of York described a pool in which floated the bones of a man who died last week. Yet prisoners were forced to drink from it or perish from thirst. Other eyewitness testimonies speak of the overwhelming stench of death and filth, a smell so potent it could cause fainting. The water's surface, covered with scum and debris, reflected not the faces of the living, but the shadows of the dying. The architecture of the prisons themselves contributed to the spread of disease. The stone walls, while formidable barriers to escape, retained moisture and prevented ventilation. Prisoners were packed together in close quarters, with little light or fresh air. The accumulation of waste and stagnant water created an environment where pathogens flourished. Even the guards, who were often reluctant to enter the deepest cells, became unwitting carriers of typhus, spreading it beyond the prison's confines. Typhus outbreaks in York's prisons had profound social and political consequences. The fear of jail fever influenced the administration of justice and public health long before the mechanisms of disease transmission were scientifically understood. Judges and lawyers feared attending assizes, and some delayed proceedings to avoid infection. The disease was seen as a curse, a divine punishment for sin and crime, reinforcing the idea that the condemned were both physically and morally contaminated. Yet behind the horror lies a stark lesson about the human cost of systemic neglect. The prisoners of York's dungeons were victims not only of their sentences, but of a society that allowed disease to become a weapon as lethal as any sword. Their suffering was compounded by invisibility, forgotten in dusty ledgers, ignored by officials, erased from history except for faint traces in stone and ink. Today, when we visit the ancient dungeons of York, the echoes of that suffering remain. The cold, damp stones bear silent witness to lives cut short by thirst and infection. The Blackwater pools have long since dried, but the legacy of those forgotten prisoners reminds us of the consequences when humanity is abandoned to neglect and decay. In remembering the prisoners who drank that black, disease-ridden water, we confront not only a chapter of history, but a timeless warning. Justice must be more than punishment. It must be tempered with humanity. The dead of York's dungeons speak across centuries, urging us never to forget the cost of indifference and the price of silence in the face of suffering. This is the story of how dungeon water, once a necessity for life, became a silent, unstoppable force of death, more terrifying and more effective than any instrument of torture. It is a story that urges reflection on the fragility of life, the cruelty of neglect, and the shadows cast by history in the cold, black waters beneath the city of York. The executioner who became a prisoner. In the shadowed halls of medieval justice, the executioner occupied a place unlike any other, feared, reviled, yet indispensable. He was the grim instrument through which the law was enforced, the harbinger of death whose presence sent ripples of terror through towns and cities. His was a role shrouded in dread and isolation, a man whose hands dealt death but whose own humanity was often denied. Yet in this twisted theater of life and death, there came moments when the executioner himself would fall from the grim pedestal, becoming the prisoner he once condemned. Among these tragic reversals, one of the most haunting stories is that of an executioner who was accused of botching his task, who, in a cruel twist of fate, was thrown into the very dungeon where he had once overseen torture and despair, left to plead desperately for the axe he once wielded with grim authority. To understand this story, we must first grasp the executioner's position in medieval society. Executioners were necessary, yet cast out. They lived on the fringes, both socially and geographically, often barred from common communal spaces and interactions. Their job was brutal and precise, to end lives swiftly, cleanly, and without error. Failure was unthinkable. The executioner was expected to be an expert with the axe, the sword, the noose, or whatever instrument was demanded by law and circumstance. His task was to deliver justice in its most final form, and to do so in a way that spared the condemned undue suffering. But the executioner was human, fallible and burdened by the weight of his own deeds. Historical records from England, France, and parts of continental Europe tell us that botched executions were not mere accidents, but deeply shameful events. When an executioner failed, whether by delivering a blow that did not sever the head in one stroke or by a rope that choked too slowly, he risked more than disgrace. In some cases, he faced arrest, punishment, or worse. The crowd, once silent spectators, could turn into a furious mob. The state, eager to maintain order and authority, sometimes made an example of the executioner to reaffirm the infallibility of the law. One chilling account comes from early modern England, where an executioner, after multiple failed attempts to decapitate a condemned prisoner, was himself seized and accused of incompetence and cruelty. In a ruthless reversal, the same authorities who had granted him power condemned him to the dungeon. This was no ordinary prison. It was the same stone chamber where prisoners had once screamed and suffered under his watch. The grim irony was not lost on contemporaries or later chroniclers. The man who had wielded power over life and death now found himself powerless, surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. The psychological torment that followed must have been unimaginable. The dungeon's cold stones, once a backdrop to his grim duties, now closed in on him as the walls echoed with memories and pain. The executioner, who had been the arbiter of death, was reduced to a pleading figure, begging for the very instrument of death he had once used to liberate others from suffering. Records from this period speak of him begging jailers for the axe, to be granted the swift release he had denied so many before. The plea was not just for death, but for a restoration of dignity in the face of an unbearable existence. Such cases highlight the brutal nature of medieval justice, which was as much about spectacle and control as it was about law. The executioner's fall was a potent symbol, a reminder that no one, not even the wielder of death, was beyond the reach of punishment. The hangman's role was paradoxical. He was necessary for the enforcement of justice, yet also a scapegoat for its failings. His humanity was often erased, his life measured only by the deaths he administered. When he faltered, society showed no mercy. Moreover, these incidents exposed the terrifyingly precarious balance of power in medieval penal systems. Executioners were caught in a cycle of violence and fear, not just from the condemned or the public, but from the authorities themselves. The executioner was a tool to be wielded and discarded, protected when useful and punished when expedient. Their fall from grace was a warning to others, an assertion that the machinery of death spared no one. The human cost extended beyond the executioner himself. Fellow prisoners, aware of his former role, often treated him with scorn or hatred. Some saw him as a traitor to their shared suffering, others as a living embodiment of the cruelty they endured. The social isolation deepened. The executioner-prisoner became a figure shunned and broken, his identity shattered. It is worth reflecting on what this story reveals about justice, cruelty, and power. The executioner's tragic reversal forces us to confront the harsh realities of a system where violence begets violence and mercy is scarce. It reveals how institutions that wield absolute power often consume their own agents in a relentless cycle. The man who once stood over the condemned, wielding final judgment, was ultimately subject to the same laws and fears that governed all lives in the shadow of the scaffold. Today, as we gaze upon the ruins of castles and prisons where such events unfolded, we are reminded that history is not simply a record of grand deeds and noble victors. It is also a tapestry woven from the lives of those caught in the dark gears of justice, executioners who became prisoners, victims who became voices echoing through time. The plea of the hangman begging for the axe remains a haunting testament to the inescapable human consequences of wielding power over life and death. It is a story that challenges us to reflect on justice not as an abstract ideal, but as a deeply human and often tragic reality. If you listen closely, beyond the stones and silence, you can still hear that desperate plea, a reminder that no one escapes the shadows of the past, and that sometimes the executioner is the one left waiting for his own final sentence. The Girl Who Drew Hope, with her Niles. In the dim, cold confines of medieval dungeons where despair was often the only companion, stories of resilience flicker like fragile candles against the overwhelming darkness. Among these haunting tales is that of a young girl, a prisoner whose suffering was etched not only in flesh, but also on the very walls that imprisoned her. She became known through the silent language of her scars, scratches, marks, and fragile images scratched into stone by her own fingernails, desperate symbols of hope carved in the most unforgiving of places. Her story begins not in grandeur, but in captivity. The girl, whose name history often fails to preserve, found herself locked away within the grim walls of a fortress dungeon. Like many young prisoners of her time, she was subjected to the brutal realities of medieval justice. Imprisoned for reasons now lost, accused perhaps of defiance, heresy, or being caught in the tides of political turmoil that swept through Dark Ages Europe. Yet, despite the weight of chains, both physical and invisible, her spirit sought a way to resist the suffocating silence. The stone walls surrounding her were cold and unyielding, the air thick with dampness and decay. There was no light save for the faintest glimmers sneaking through cracks or the occasional flicker of a distant torch. Time in such a place became a slow torment, each day indistinguishable from the last. Food was meager, often barely enough to sustain life, and the body withered under the combined assault of hunger, cold, and neglect. In such bleakness, the mind could easily fracture, and the heart might surrender. But this girl found a way to fight back, not with sword or words, but with her own nails. With nothing but her fingertips as tools, she began to scratch into the unforgiving stone. At first, these were faint marks, barely visible, but gradually they took form. Shapes emerged, delicate angels with outstretched wings, stars glittering in imagined skies, symbols of light piercing the darkness. These images were more than mere scratches. They were a language of hope, a silent prayer, and an act of defiance against the void threatening to swallow her whole. These carvings held power. In an environment designed to crush will, to erase identity, the girl's art became a refuge for her soul. Each scratch was a breath, a moment stolen from despair. The angels represented protection, guardians watching over her frail existence. The stars spoke of distant freedom, a cosmos vast and uncontained, worlds beyond the stone and shadows. In the cruel geometry of her cell, these symbols created a sacred space, a small sanctuary of imagination and faith. Historical accounts from various medieval prisons sometimes hint at such acts of silent rebellion. Prisoners, especially those young or desperate, would find subtle ways to mark their existence, to tell the story of their suffering and their hope, even when voices were silenced. These carvings, often discovered centuries later by archaeologists or castle custodians, reveal the intimate human need to resist erasure, to claim dignity even when everything else is stripped away. The girl's fate, like so many caught in the machinery of medieval justice, was tragic. When her body was found, it was curled beside the very images she had scratched, fragile testaments to a spirit that clung to light even as life ebbed away. The physical toll of imprisonment, starvation, and isolation had claimed her, but her marks remained, silently screaming the story of her endurance. Her story raises profound questions about suffering and hope. How does one maintain humanity when the world conspires to break it? How can a simple act, scratching stone with nails, become a declaration of existence and faith? In a society that punished not only bodies but spirits, the girl's fragile art stands as a rebellion. It says that even in the deepest darkness, the human soul reaches out, longing for meaning, for beauty, for a glimpse of something beyond pain. This tale also reminds us of the countless unnamed prisoners, especially women and children, whose lives are obscured by history's shadows. Their voices often lost, their stories buried beneath layers of stone and silence. The girl who drew hope with her nails becomes a symbol for all of them, a poignant reminder that history is not only shaped by kings and battles, but also by the quiet acts of resistance from those forgotten by time. Today, the scratched images remain, weathered but enduring. They are preserved as haunting relics within ancient castles and prisons, studied by historians and archaeologists who seek to piece together lives otherwise erased. These marks serve not only as evidence of cruelty, but also as proof of resilience, a testament that in the harshest conditions, hope can find a way to leave its mark. The power of the girl's story lies not only in the images she created, but in the raw human need they represent. To be seen, to be remembered, to assert existence against oblivion. Her nails became instruments of survival, transforming stone from a prison into a canvas for endurance. The angels and stars she carved are more than decoration. They are a legacy of courage, a fragile light shining across centuries. In reflecting on this haunting episode, we confront the profound impact of isolation, despair, and the indomitable human will. The girl who drew hope with her nails invites us to remember that even in our darkest hours, the impulse to create, to imagine, and to resist remains alive. Her silent story resonates with anyone who has faced confinement, injustice, or invisibility. Her marks on stone echo a universal truth. When all else is stripped away, hope can be etched in the smallest acts. The girl's life, though cut tragically short, endures through her art, a testament that even in despair, the human spirit reaches for light. The dungeon where silence was a death sentence. Beneath the cold stone walls of some of history's darkest prisons, there existed a punishment more terrifying than chains or the rack, a dungeon where silence was not merely expected, but brutally enforced. Here, speaking was forbidden, and the faintest whisper could seal a prisoner's fate. Those caught breaking this brutal law faced horrific consequences: removal of the tongue or even death. This was not a myth or legend. It was a grim reality in certain medieval and early modern prisons, where silence became a weapon wielded to crush the human spirit. The roots of this chilling practice can be traced to the ruthless methods used by authorities determined to maintain absolute control over prisoners. In an age when prisons were overflowing, disease rampant, and rebellion a constant threat, jailers sought ways to suppress communication and plotting among inmates. The idea was simple, yet cruel. Without speech, prisoners could not conspire, coordinate escapes, or even comfort each other. Silence was the ultimate isolation, a form of psychological torment designed to break minds as surely as chains broke bodies. Historical records from prisons like the Tower of London and those used during the Spanish Inquisition describe cells where the penalty for speaking was savage and immediate. Tongue removal was the cruelest form of punishment. Prisoners caught whispering or attempting to speak would be dragged before a grim executioner, whose blade or scalpel would swiftly sever the tongue. This act was both punishment and warning, leaving the prisoner unable to speak ever again, turning them into mute specters within the prison walls. Many did not survive the procedure, bleeding out from the wound or succumbing later to infection in the filthy, unsanitary cells. The psychological impact of enforced silence was profound. Humans are social creatures. Speech is essential not only for communication, but for maintaining identity and sanity. Prisoners confined in these silent dungeons quickly found themselves engulfed by crushing loneliness. Deprived of voice, they were cut off from the very means of expressing pain, fear, or hope. This sensory deprivation often led to hallucinations, mental breakdowns, and in many cases, madness. Accounts from survivors describe how days and weeks blended into a terrifying void where the mind became a prison within itself. The enforcement of silence was often accompanied by other brutal methods. In some prisons, guards would provoke inmates by whispering just out of reach, tempting them to respond. A single murmur, a breath too loud, was enough to bring the cruelest consequences. Tears, screams of pain, or cries for mercy were also forbidden, forcing prisoners to endure suffering in agonizing silence. This created a suffocating atmosphere where fear of punishment permeated the air, and silence was both shield and shackle. The origins of these practices are tangled in the grim history of state power and punishment. During the Inquisition, silence was a tool of control and confession. By isolating prisoners in mute agony, interrogators hoped to break their will without leaving visible scars, compelling them to reveal secrets or recant heresy. In England, the Tudor and Stuart eras saw similar punishments meted out in prisons notorious for cruelty. The removal of a tongue was not only physical mutilation, but symbolic, a silencing of dissent, a warning to others. Despite its horror, enforced silence sometimes gave rise to secret, nonverbal forms of communication. Prisoners developed ways to convey messages through gestures, scratching marks on walls, or tapping codes. These silent rebellions underscored a fundamental truth. Even in the absence of voice, the human spirit searches desperately to connect and resist erasure. The legacy of the silent dungeons echoes into modern times. While tongue removal as punishment is thankfully a thing of the past, enforced silence remains a method of psychological control in various forms, from solitary confinement to censorship. The story of those who suffered in these cells reminds us of the essential power of voice, not merely as sound, but as an assertion of existence, resistance, and humanity. Visiting the ruins of old prisons today, one can still feel the oppressive weight of that silence. The empty cells seem to absorb sound, as if mourning the voices lost within. The silence is not peace, it is absence. It is a reminder of how deeply the denial of speech can wound a person's very soul. In a world that often takes for granted the simple act of speaking, the dungeon where silence was a death sentence stands as a chilling testament to the power of voice, the cruelty of enforced quiet, and the resilience of those who dared to whisper in the shadows. The skeleton found in a wall. With shackles. Buried within the thick, cold walls of London's ancient dungeons lies a secret frozen in time, a secret uncovered only recently by the relentless hands of archaeology. In a small chamber, hidden behind centuries of brick and mortar, a skeleton was found sealed into the very wall itself. What makes this discovery chilling beyond measure is that the skeleton was still bound by shackles, iron restraints that once held a living human captive. This was no ordinary burial or forgotten grave. It was a grim testament to a form of punishment so cruel and final that it challenges our understanding of medieval justice. The burial alive of a prisoner, left to die slowly and alone, walled in and erased. The skeleton's discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community, prompting new questions about the dark practices once tolerated and sometimes sanctioned in London's dungeons. In a time when prisons were overcrowded, legal protections sparse, and humanity often an afterthought, The line between incarceration and execution blurred in terrifying ways. Prisoners were sometimes condemned not only to physical captivity, but to a slow death in the shadows, forgotten, silenced, and entombed within walls meant to imprison both body and memory. The very presence of shackles on the skeleton is a haunting symbol. Shackles were not merely instruments of restraint. They were statements of ownership, of control. To shackle someone was to deny freedom in the most literal way. Yet to find these shackles still attached after death, inside a sealed wall, implies a punishment even more severe than imprisonment: the deliberate walled-in burial of a living person. Such a fate was reserved for those deemed most dangerous, most undesirable, or most expendable. Historical records from medieval and early modern London hint at this terrifying practice, though often cloaked in euphemism or denied outright. The walled burial could be both a form of execution and a means of permanent removal. No trial, no ceremony, no grave marker. It was a method of silencing dissent, punishing betrayal, or erasing inconvenient lives. The victim, trapped in darkness and confinement, faced death in isolation, slowly succumbing to starvation, thirst, or suffocation. The psychological terror of such a punishment is almost impossible to imagine. To be alive, immobilized in shackles, trapped behind stone and mortar, surrounded by the cold silence of the wall as the world continues without you. This was a death not just of the body, but of identity and hope. The wall became both tomb and prison, an eternal sentence from which there was no appeal. Archaeologists studying the site carefully documented the position of the skeleton and the shackles, noting signs that the individual might have struggled, yet was ultimately overcome by the cold finality of entombment. The absence of any attempts at rescue or removal suggests that the person was deliberately sealed away, forgotten by those above. The skeletal remains tell a story of cruelty institutionalized, of justice exercised without mercy or recognition. This discovery forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our past. That justice systems once operated in darkness, often invisible to public scrutiny. That human life was sometimes reduced to a problem to be hidden away rather than protected, and that punishment was as much about erasure as it was about correction. Today, as the skeleton lies preserved in museum archives and historical study, it serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of dignity in justice. The shackles still attached to the bones are not just artifacts. They are silent witnesses to a life ended in suffering and silence. The wall that once trapped this prisoner now stands as a testament, an architectural scar on history. Through this grim find, we are urged to remember the nameless, to listen to the silent voices sealed within walls, and to strive for a justice that never again buries its victims alive, or consigns any human being to such an unimaginable fate. In the echoes of that sealed chamber, we hear not only the past's cruelty, but a call to vigilance, compassion, and humanity in the present. The skeleton with shackles in the wall is more than a discovery. It is a story etched in bone and stone, warning us of the darkness that can thrive when mercy is forgotten and punishment becomes oblivion. The king who disguised his dungeon as a cellar. Beneath the grandeur and regal splendor of Windsor Castle lies a secret so dark it contrasts sharply with the image of royal majesty, a hidden world where pain was masked by elegance and cruelty concealed beneath the guise of ordinary utility. King Edward I, known for his relentless campaigns and iron will, harbored a chilling secret. Private torture chambers disguised as wine cellars, hidden beneath the very foundations of his palace. These underground dungeons were not mere prisons. They were carefully concealed theaters of suffering, accessible only through secret trapdoors that ensured the horrors within remained invisible to all but the most trusted. Edward I ruled England at a time when power was absolute and dissent was met with swift, brutal punishment. His reign was marked by wars to subjugate the Welsh and Scots, and within the walls of Windsor Castle, his seat of power, the machinery of control was both visible and invisible. The wine cellars, filled with barrels of the finest vintages, were a symbol of wealth and sophistication, a place where the nobility might gather, drink, and celebrate. Yet beneath these barrels, behind false walls and concealed stairways, the king's enemies faced a far darker fate. The concept of disguising torture chambers as wine cellars was as much psychological as practical. The juxtaposition of pleasure and pain, luxury above, suffering below, was a deliberate reminder of the king's dominance over life and death. Only those chosen by the king knew the locations of the hidden trapdoors that led down narrow, shadowy stairs into chambers where screams were muffled by stone. This secrecy ensured that the existence of these torture rooms remained a whisper, known only to the inner circle of the monarchy and the loyal guards sworn to silence. Prisoners brought to these dungeons were often political opponents, rebels, or suspects in plots against the crown. The king's agents understood that public displays of punishment could stir unrest or sympathy for the condemned. So the hidden chambers served as a place to extract confessions through terror and pain, shielded from prying eyes. The architecture of the cellars, cold, damp, and claustrophobic, amplified the psychological torment. The faint clinking of chains, the smell of damp stone mingled with the faint aroma of wine from above, created a disorienting and oppressive atmosphere. Historical records, though scarce due to the deliberate secrecy, reveal chilling details of the methods used within these hidden chambers. Instruments of torture were carefully concealed, appearing as ordinary cellar tools or hidden within the walls. The secrecy of the location allowed torturers to work with impunity, free from public scrutiny or interference. Some prisoners were subjected to prolonged interrogation, their bodies and wills broken in the dim light far beneath the royal festivities above. This blending of the cellar's mundane function with the horrors below also served a symbolic purpose. It represented the king's absolute control, not only over the land and its people, but over the very spaces they inhabited. Where others saw a cellar stocked with wine, the king saw a prison for enemies, a fortress of silence where power was enforced without witnesses. The trapdoors were gateways between worlds, from celebration to suffering, from light to darkness, from life to the brink of death. The legacy of King Edward I's disguised dungeons at Windsor Castle is a stark reminder of how power can be hidden in plain sight. It reveals the lengths to which rulers went to maintain control, balancing the spectacle of authority with the shadow of fear. Today, while Windsor Castle stands as a symbol of British heritage and monarchy, beneath its stone floors lie echoes of a past where luxury and cruelty coexisted in terrifying proximity. A king's cellar where the wine was sweet, but the secrets bitter and deadly. The day the dungeon flooded with sewage. In the grim history of medieval and early modern prisons, the horror did not come solely from the bars or the guards, but from the very architecture that was meant to contain human suffering. Among the most notorious of these places was Newgate Prison in London, an institution infamous not just for its overcrowding and brutality, but for a terrifying disaster that unfolded beneath its stone walls, a catastrophic sewage flood that turned the dungeon into a watery grave. Imagine the cramped, dark cells of Newgate, where prisoners were packed like cattle, their fates sealed by the cold judgment of the courts above. The air was thick with disease and despair. Beneath the ground, an ancient and overburdened sewer system ran, meant to carry away the city's waste, but poorly maintained and prone to failure. On a dreadful day in the prison's long history, this system gave way. A sewer line burst under the prison's foundation, unleashing a torrent of human waste into the dungeons below. The flood was sudden and merciless. Cells that once held men, women, and children were rapidly submerged under a rising tide of raw sewage, filthy, toxic water laden with human excrement, refuse, and disease. The stench was unimaginable, a suffocating miasma that clawed at the lungs and blurred the senses. Prisoners screamed, pounding on the iron bars, desperate for rescue. But the gates above remained firmly shut. The guards, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, hesitated to intervene. To open the gates too soon would risk the flood washing out into the corridors, spreading chaos and infection through the prison. To wait was to sentence those below to a slow, agonizing death. Dozens perished in the darkness, their bodies pulled under by the unrelenting sewage. Many drowned, unable to escape the rising waters in their confined cells. Others succumbed to the noxious fumes and toxins in the air, their cries fading into silence as disease took hold. The floodwaters carried with them the detritus of countless lives, feces, bodily fluids, rotting food, and the remnants of years of neglect. It was not merely a natural disaster, but a human tragedy born of overcrowding, neglect, and the cruelty embedded in the penal system itself. Historical records and eyewitness accounts from later investigations reveal the grim aftermath. When guards finally opened the dungeon gates, they were met with scenes of unimaginable horror. Prisoners' bodies floating or clinging to the walls, faces twisted in terror and suffering. The waterlogged cells bore silent testimony to the desperate struggle for survival that had taken place. The flood left behind not only physical destruction, but a scar on the collective memory of the city and its justice system. Newgate Prison, already notorious for its inhumane conditions, became an emblem of neglect and abuse. The sewage flood exposed the lethal consequences of cramming more bodies into limited space without regard for sanitation or safety. It also illustrated the indifference of those charged with oversight, guards and officials who prioritized order and control over the lives trapped beneath their feet. This disaster was not unique to Newgate. Across Europe, medieval and early modern prisons shared similar vulnerabilities. Primitive sewer systems, lack of proper drainage, and overcrowded dungeons where waste quickly became a deadly flood. But the Newgate sewage flood stands out for the scale of its tragedy and the harrowing details preserved in historical accounts. The psychological impact on survivors and witnesses was profound. Those who escaped the flood were marked for life by the experience. Some became shell-shocked, their minds haunted by the cries of drowning comrades and the suffocating darkness. Guards who witnessed the aftermath spoke of nightmares and a creeping dread that lingered long after the waters receded. This event also sparked debates, albeit limited and slow-moving, about prison reform. It became a grim reminder that the machinery of justice was not just about punishment, but about the preservation of life and dignity, however faint. The flood forced authorities, however reluctantly, to confront the deadly consequences of neglecting sanitation and humane treatment within prisons. The Newgate sewage flood reminds us that history's horrors are not always wrought by human cruelty alone. Sometimes they arise from the failures of infrastructure and the willful blindness of those in power. It is a story of suffering beneath the surface, of lives lost not just to justice, but to rot and water. It is a chilling testament to the darkness that thrives when systems meant to protect and govern instead imprison and destroy. Even today, as we walk past the site where Newgate once stood, beneath the modern city streets, echoes of that terrible flood seem to whisper, a warning from history about the cost of neglect, the fragility of human dignity, and the shadows that lie beneath. The prisoner who escaped by going mad. In the shadowed silence of medieval prisons, where stone walls whispered of suffering and despair, survival was often a battle, fought not only against guards or chains, but against the mind itself. Among the countless souls locked away in dungeons designed to crush hope, there is a particularly enigmatic story. That of a monk who escaped captivity, not through physical means, but through the fragile, perilous strategy of feigning madness. His tale is a testament to the resilience and cunning born from desperation, revealing how, in the darkest prisons, the mind could become both a sanctuary and a weapon. Medieval prisons were places of profound cruelty. Unlike modern penitentiaries, they were often cold, damp, and overcrowded, with prisoners subject to starvation, disease, and psychological torment. For those imprisoned under political or religious suspicion, such as monks or clergy caught in the turbulent tides of ecclesiastical conflict or royal power struggles, the stakes were higher still. They faced a long, indefinite confinement, often without trial, and brutal treatment intended to break their faith and will. This monk, whose name history has not preserved, was confined in a dungeon where the boundaries between time and sanity blurred. Years passed like shadows lengthening in the dark, with only the faintest light of hope flickering beyond his cell. The conditions were designed not merely to punish, but to erase identity and spirit. The walls seemed to close in not only on the body, but on the mind, driving many prisoners to despair or madness. But the monk was different. Faced with the unrelenting horror of confinement, he adopted a survival strategy born from acute insight into human nature. Instead of resisting openly, he chose to feign madness. He began to behave unpredictably, muttering incoherent words, rocking gently, and performing gestures that seemed nonsensical or disjointed. His captors, trained to recognize threats and rebellion, saw in his apparent insanity a broken mind no longer capable of plotting or defiance. In medieval thought, madness was often misunderstood and feared, but also a state that removed one from the category of rational threat. A madman was seen as harmless, an object of pity or scorn, but rarely a danger to the ruling order. By convincing his jailers that his mind had shattered, the monk cleverly transformed himself from prisoner to non-threat, gaining a degree of freedom within his cage, less scrutiny, fewer brutal interrogations, and ultimately release. Historical records of such tactics are rare, often shrouded in ambiguity, but scattered references suggest that feigning madness was a known, if desperate, means of survival. The very act of madness could be a mask, a performance so convincing that it fooled the keepers and guards, who were eager to rid themselves of troublesome captives. The monk's release under the guise of no longer a threat reflects this grim calculus. Better to free a madman than risk further trouble. What happened to the monk after his release remains a mystery. Unlike other prisoners whose fates are documented through trial records or execution lists, he vanished from history's pages, leaving only this tale of cunning and endurance. It is tempting to imagine him slipping quietly into obscurity, perhaps finding refuge in a monastery or remote village, forever marked by the ordeal yet alive because of his guile. This story invites us to reflect on the brutal intersection of power, madness, and survival in medieval justice. It challenges modern perceptions of imprisonment as purely physical and underscores the profound psychological warfare waged within prison walls. The monk's choice to go mad was not surrender, but a radical act of resistance, a reclaiming of agency in a world designed to strip it away. Moreover, his tale resonates with contemporary understandings of mental health, deception, and survival strategies under extreme duress. Feigning madness as a shield against persecution has echoes throughout history, from political prisoners to whistleblowers, illustrating a timeless human instinct to protect the self when all other defenses fail. In the end, the prisoner who escaped by going mad is a figure both tragic and heroic. His story speaks to the indomitable will to survive, the creative power of the mind even in chains, and the elusive boundary between sanity and madness when freedom is at stake. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest escape is not through walls or locks, but through the mind's daring performance on the edge of reason. The dungeon where you paid to not be tortured. In the shadowed stone walls of Corfe Castle, a chilling reality unfolded within its infamous dungeons, one where wealth dictated not only comfort, but survival itself. Unlike the common prisoners who faced the brutal indifference of captivity, the wealthy incarcerated found their fate tied to the merciless whims of those who held the keys. In these dark cells, money was more than power. It was a lifeline, the currency for mercy, food, and even basic humanity. Corfe Castle, perched ominously in the English countryside, was notorious for its use as a prison throughout medieval and early modern times. But its dungeons were no ordinary holding cells. The conditions inside were horrendous. Stone walls slick with damp, narrow spaces barely large enough to lie down, and a pervasive stench of decay and desperation. Disease and starvation stalked every corner. Yet for prisoners of means, a perverse system emerged. Wealthy captives were expected to pay bribes to the jailers to secure the barest essentials of survival. Food was never guaranteed. While common prisoners were given meager, often rotten rations, those who could afford to pay received scraps of better sustenance, sometimes even cooked meals delivered through corrupt guards. Blankets, a luxury against the bitter cold, were withheld unless purchased. Without warmth, many perished from exposure during the harsh English winters. Even the simplest comforts, extra bedding, lighter chains, or less brutal treatment, were commodities to be bought and sold in the shadow economy of the dungeon. The cruelty of this system was stark. Those who failed to bribe were left to rot in filth and misery. Their cries for help often met with deaf ears or cruel jeers. Whippings and beatings were common punishments for prisoners who dared to complain or resist the extortion. It was a system that institutionalized suffering for the poor and rewarded the wealthy with the illusion of mercy. Historical records reveal harrowing testimonies from Corfe's prisoners. One nobleman wrote of being forced to beg his jailer for scraps of food, describing the torment of watching fellow captives succumb to starvation while guards pocketed their bribes. Another account tells of a merchant who, unable to pay the escalating demands, was left chained without blankets through a freezing winter, his health deteriorating rapidly. Such testimonies expose the merciless interplay of power, money, and survival behind the castle's forbidding walls. This cruel marketplace of suffering reflected broader societal inequalities of the time. The justice system, far from impartial, was skewed in favor of those with means. Bribery was not an exception, but a norm within many medieval prisons, Corfe Castle among the most notorious. The rich could purchase not only physical comforts, but also favors, delays in trial, softer guards, or even temporary release. Meanwhile, the poor faced unrelenting brutality, often condemned to die forgotten in darkness. Corfe Castle's dungeons, therefore, were more than prisons. They were theaters of social injustice where the line between justice and corruption blurred. The very act of imprisonment became a negotiation, a business transaction fueled by greed and cruelty. For wealthy prisoners, survival was a costly endeavor, a daily gamble on whether they could meet the demands of those who held their lives in their hands. The legacy of these mercenary dungeons serves as a grim reminder of how power and wealth can distort justice and humanity. Though centuries have passed since those dark days, echoes of Corfe's system resonate in modern discussions about prison conditions, inequality, and human rights. It challenges us to remember that the true measure of justice lies not in wealth or influence, but in the dignity afforded to every human being, regardless of status. Visiting Corfe Castle today, one can still sense the oppressive atmosphere of those brutal dungeons. The cold stones, the narrow confines, and the silence speak of countless souls who suffered, some able to buy fleeting mercy, others left to endure unthinkable torment. In these shadows, the story of the dungeon where you paid to not be tortured remains etched in stone and memory, a haunting testament to the dark intersections of money, power, and survival. The iron collar that killed over time. In the shadowed depths of Oxford Castle, a grim instrument of slow death once found its cruel home, the iron collar. Unlike the swift executioners or the sudden tortures that history often remembers, this device was designed to kill with relentless patience. It was a collar not of mercy, but of unyielding pressure, an iron band that tightened ever so gradually around a prisoner's throat with every movement, each breath, each attempt at resistance, until life itself was crushed beneath the weight of unceasing agony. This was punishment extended across days, weeks, even months, a torment that fused physical pain with psychological despair, leaving victims trapped in a cycle of suffering that slowly suffocated body and soul alike. The iron collar was no mere restraint. It was a weapon engineered for control and slow annihilation. Crafted from heavy iron, the collar was locked securely around the neck of a prisoner, often linked to a chain fixed to a wall or post, restricting movement yet allowing enough freedom to provoke tightening pressure. Each twist of the head, each turn of the body, caused the collar's mechanisms, sometimes a threaded screw, sometimes a lever system, to constrict incrementally. The prisoner was caught in a macabre dance with the device. Move, and the collar tightened. Remain still, and the mental anguish mounted as the crushing grip continued to assert its dominance. Historical records from Oxford Castle, one of England's most notorious prisons, describe how these collars were used on a variety of prisoners, criminals, political detainees, and those deemed troublesome by the authorities. Unlike brutal tortures intended for rapid confession or punishment, the iron collar was an instrument of slow psychological warfare. Prisoners wore it day and night, forced into unnatural stillness or agonizing movement, constantly aware that any motion could be fatal. The terror of an ever-tightening noose pressed upon the throat was compounded by the knowledge that death might come not immediately, but through gradual suffocation, starvation, or blood loss. Survivors' testimonies, rare as they are, reveal the unimaginable ordeal endured. Many recounted the relentless tightening as a sensation like being strangled slowly, the pressure causing excruciating pain in the neck, throat, and shoulders. Swallowing became agonizing, breathing shallow and labored. The collar left wounds, abrasions, bruises, sometimes open sores, while the constant pressure impaired circulation and nerve function. Some prisoners struggled to speak, their voices reduced to hoarse whispers, their cries for mercy muffled beneath the iron grip. The psychological torment was equally devastating. Prisoners lived in perpetual fear of movement, trapped in a paradox where stillness might prolong life, but immobility invited madness. Sleep was fragmented and haunted by the collar's pressure, dreams twisted into nightmares of suffocation. Over time, many succumbed not just to the physical torture but to despair, losing hope as days blurred into weeks. Some died alone in the cold cells of Oxford Castle, victims of a slow, mechanical execution that left no marks of dramatic violence but a deep imprint of cruelty. Why such a method? The iron collar was part of a broader system of medieval punishment aimed at exerting control through pain and fear. It sent a message to all who witnessed or heard of its use. Disobedience would be met not only with death, but with prolonged suffering. The collar's slow killing was a demonstration of power, a psychological tool to break prisoners' will before their bodies gave out. It also functioned as a form of imprisonment that required minimal guard intervention. The device itself was the jailer. The legacy of the iron collar is a chilling reminder of how justice systems once operated in shadows, where cruelty was sanctioned and humanity often ignored. Oxford Castle, now a place of history and tourism, holds in its walls the echoes of those who suffered beneath the iron's relentless squeeze. The collars themselves, preserved in museums or recreated in historical exhibits, stand as haunting artifacts, cold, unyielding, and silent witnesses to the slow destruction of human life. To reflect on the iron collar is to confront a past where torture was methodical, where death was drawn out to maximize suffering, and where punishment was as much psychological as physical. It challenges us to appreciate the evolution of human rights and justice, reminding us how vital it is to guard against cruelty masked as discipline. The iron collar that killed over time teaches us that some devices of torture are not remembered for swift brutality, but for the lingering shadows they cast, shadows of pain that stretch endlessly, suffocating hope and crushing the spirit. It is a story etched into the stones of Oxford Castle and the bones of those who wore the collar's iron embrace, a stark warning from Heist. The secret tunnel of forgotten skeletons. Beneath the rugged, wind-swept hills of Scotland lies a secret that time tried desperately to bury. A forgotten escape tunnel beneath an ancient keep, a tunnel that became a silent tomb for those desperate souls who sought freedom but instead found death. This dark passage, long collapsed and lost to memory, was unearthed centuries later, revealing the skeletal remains of prisoners who had attempted a desperate flight from captivity, only to starve and perish. Deep underground. The story of this secret tunnel is one of hope, despair, and the cruel ironies of confinement, a chilling chapter in the harsh history of medieval Scotland. Castles and keeps across Scotland were not merely residences of nobles or fortresses of defense. They were also prisons. Political prisoners, rebels, and criminals were often confined within thick stone walls, their lives tightly controlled by harsh guards and unyielding authority. Legend spoke of secret tunnels carved beneath the earth, hidden passageways designed for surprise attacks or secret exits. But sometimes, these tunnels became prisons themselves, their dark corridors turning from paths of salvation into graves of forgotten souls. The particular tunnel beneath this Scottish keep was a feat of clandestine architecture, a narrow, twisting corridor built to allow a covert exit in times of siege. Over years of neglect and warfare, the tunnel was forgotten by the living, its entrance buried beneath rubble and earth. Yet centuries before its rediscovery, it had become the site of a tragedy so profound that it echoes through history. Prisoners, perhaps during a moment of chaos or rebellion, learned of the tunnel and attempted to use it to flee. The details are shrouded in mystery. Did guards turn a blind eye, or was the attempt a desperate act of defiance? What is clear is that these men and women entered the tunnel seeking freedom, only to find themselves trapped in an underground labyrinth without light, air, or food. The tunnel, narrow and winding, offered no safe passage. As they moved deeper, the entrance collapsed behind them, whether by accident or design remains uncertain, cutting off any hope of return. Trapped in darkness, the prisoners faced a nightmare beyond imprisonment. Their torches burned low, shadows clawed at the stone walls, and the cold seeped into their bones. With no food and no hope of rescue, starvation set in swiftly. Days stretched into weeks. The strongest succumbed first, their bodies falling one by one into the dust and debris of the tunnel floor. Those left behind witnessed the slow fading of their companions, each death amplifying the weight of silence and despair. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the cries of the dying swallowed by stone. When the tunnel was finally excavated centuries later, archaeologists uncovered a grim scene. Skeletons piled in the cramped passageway, some clutching bones as if in final defiance, others collapsed in positions of exhaustion and resignation. The remains bore the marks of starvation, rib cages prominent, bones fragile and brittle. The tunnel itself, carved by human hands but transformed into a tomb by time and fate, told a story of tragic human endurance and ultimate defeat. This discovery opened a window into the brutal realities of medieval incarceration in Scotland. Prisons were not just places of physical confinement, but realms of psychological torment where hope could turn to despair in an instant. The idea that escape was possible gave prisoners strength to endure, but the cruel irony of the secret tunnel turned prison is a haunting reminder of how freedom could be snatched away by forces beyond their control. Historical records of the keep and its prisoners, though sparse, corroborate the existence of desperate attempts to flee and the harsh punishments that followed. The fear of escape was so great that keepers sometimes sealed tunnels or entrances to prevent such occurrences, inadvertently condemning those who sought liberty to slow deaths underground. This tragic intersection of security and cruelty reveals the harsh calculus of medieval justice, a system that valued order over mercy, containment over compassion. The tunnel and its skeletons serve as a solemn monument to forgotten lives, a reminder of the countless prisoners who suffered in silence, their stories buried beneath the stones of a fortress. It is a stark testament to the fragility of hope in the face of overwhelming despair, and to the human spirit's relentless yearning for freedom, even when it seems impossible. Today, the keep stands restored, its stones polished and pathways open to visitors. Yet beneath its floors lies the silent testimony of those who never emerged, their bones whispering the grim tale of a secret tunnel turned tomb. Walking these grounds, one cannot help but feel the weight of history pressing down. A palpable presence of lives lost in shadows, of dreams extinguished beneath the earth. The secret tunnel of forgotten skeletons challenges us to confront the dark legacies of the past, to remember that history is not only told by victors, but also by those who vanished in silence. It urges us to reflect on the human cost of imprisonment and the enduring quest for freedom that, even in the bleakest of circumstances, continues to define us. The dungeon that became a tomb for plague victims. In the grim annals of the Black Death's devastating sweep across medieval Europe, few stories capture the stark cruelty and human despair like that of the sealed dungeons beneath Durham Castle. When the plague tore through England in the mid-14th century, it did not discriminate between nobles and peasants, free men or prisoners. Yet within the cold stone walls of Durham's dungeons, a nightmare unfolded that was uniquely horrific. One where the living were trapped with death itself, locked away and left to perish in unbearable silence, their bodies decaying together in darkness and isolation. Durham, a fortified city and seat of ecclesiastical power, was no stranger to hardship. Its castle dungeons were designed to hold criminals and enemies, places of punishment and misery. But as the Black Death ravaged the population, fear and desperation gripped those in power. The plague was poorly understood, its deadly contagion provoking terror and drastic measures. To contain the spread, authorities resorted to sealing off places suspected of harboring infection, including prisons. In a decision both harsh and chilling, the dungeons beneath Durham Castle were closed off, gates barred from the outside, no aid or relief allowed to those trapped inside. The prisoners within these dark, cramped cells were left to face a fate worse than death's swift strike. With no food, no water, and no chance of escape, they slowly succumbed not only to the plague, but also to starvation, thirst, and despair. The walls became a tomb, holding in the last gasps and agonized whispers of dozens who had nowhere else to turn. The air inside grew thick with the stench of sickness and decay, a suffocating miasma that blurred the line between life and death. Historical accounts and later records paint a grim tableau. The bodies of plague victims piled in the cells, left to rot where they fell. The living huddled beside the dead, sharing their final breaths amid the overwhelming presence of death. The dungeon ceased to be a prison in the traditional sense. It became a mass grave sealed by fear and the ruthless calculus of survival. This act of abandonment was not just a reflection of medieval ignorance about disease, but a stark testament to the dehumanization that fear and panic can breed. Outside, life in Durham carried on with a fragile semblance of normalcy, but beneath the castle, a silent tragedy was unfolding, a microcosm of the greater plague that ravaged the land. The decision to seal the dungeon was driven by desperation, yet it revealed the harsh realities of medieval justice and public health. The prisoners, already marginalized and condemned by society, were discarded utterly. Their suffering was erased, their voices silenced beneath layers of stone and death. The psychological toll on the community and the guards was profound. Guards assigned to watch over the sealed dungeons spoke of haunting silence, broken only by the occasional anguished scream that slipped through cracks before the gates were sealed. Some reportedly suffered nightmares and breakdowns, unable to reconcile their duty with the horrors they knew were unfolding just beneath their feet. The plague was not only a physical contagion, but a spiritual blight that corroded compassion and humanity. Archaeological findings in Durham and other plague sites corroborate these grim stories. Mass graves, skeletal remains found in confined spaces, and historical documents aligned to reveal the magnitude of neglect and the tragic fates of those trapped in such conditions. These discoveries provide haunting reminders of how the Black Death reshaped societies not only through death, but through the brutal choices made in its wake. The sealed dungeon of Durham stands as a stark symbol of the plague's cruelty and the limits of medieval response. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about fear, isolation, and the human cost of survival when society fractures under pressure. This episode is a haunting chapter in the story of the Black Death, a tale not just of disease, but of abandonment and silence in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. Today, the echoes of those lost in the dungeon remain woven into Durham's history. The stone walls that once confined them still stand, silent witnesses to a tragedy born from fear and neglect. Their story compels us to remember the forgotten victims of pandemics past and challenges us to carry forward lessons of empathy, care, and the value of every human life, even when darkness seems to close in. If you listen carefully amid the quiet corridors of Durham Castle, you might still hear faint whispers from that sealed dungeon, a reminder that some prisons are more than places of confinement. They are tombs where the echoes of lost souls linger, warning us never to forget the depths of human suffering in history's darkest hours. The Watchtower, where guards were chained too, in the grim and shadowed world of medieval dungeons, where prisoners suffered under the harshest conditions and often overlooked irony unfolded in the very spaces meant to guard them. In some of the most infamous fortresses and castles, not only were the prisoners shackled and confined, but the guards themselves, those tasked with watching over the condemned, were sometimes chained in place as well. This unsettling practice, designed to prevent bribery and escape, transformed the Watchtower into a prison within a prison, blurring the lines between captor and captive. Medieval castles and dungeons were complex systems of control, and maintaining order within these dark walls was a challenge fraught with peril and mistrust. Guards were entrusted with great responsibility to ensure prisoners did not flee, to prevent smuggling of contraband, and to enforce the often brutal rules set by lords and monarchs. Yet the temptations facing these men were immense. Bribery was a constant threat. Prisoners' families, political factions, or even sympathetic allies could offer sums or promises to win the favor of the jailers. Escape plots often relied on the complicity or negligence of those meant to stand vigilant. To combat this dangerous vulnerability, some dungeons adopted a harsh and paradoxical solution: the chaining of guards themselves. In certain watchtowers, those critical choke points guarding dungeon entrances or prison cells, guards were fastened to heavy iron rings or shackles embedded in the stone. These chains were designed not just as symbols of authority, but as literal restraints, severely limiting the guards' movements. This ensured they could not easily be bribed to open doors or slip keys to prisoners, nor could they flee in the event of a riot or sudden attack. This arrangement turned the watchtower into a place of shared confinement. Guards found themselves as trapped as those they oversaw, caught in a system that did not trust even its enforcers. The chains bound their ankles or wrists, anchoring them to the doorway or wall. They could not patrol freely or move to respond swiftly to emergencies. Instead, they endured a forced immobility, standing watch through long nights in discomfort, exposed to cold stone, damp air, and the mental strain of captivity. Historical records and architectural studies reveal examples of these chained guard posts in castles across Europe. Norwich Castle, the Tower of London, and various continental fortresses documented the use of such restrictive measures. The practice speaks volumes about the medieval mindset. Mistrust was so pervasive that even those entrusted with authority had to be controlled through physical restraint. The fear of corruption and collusion overshadowed the need for agile defense or humane treatment of those tasked with prison duty. The psychological impact on these chained guards was profound. Forced into unnatural stillness for hours or days, they suffered fatigue, muscle cramps, and the demoralizing effect of their own captivity. The monotony was punctuated by the echoes of prisoners' cries or the distant sounds of unrest, heightening their isolation. Guards who were once agents of control became prisoners of their own posts, bound by iron and suspicion. This paradox of the chained guard illuminates the complexities of power dynamics in medieval incarceration. The very system designed to maintain order bred its own insecurity, fostering an environment where control was maintained through mutual restraint. Prisoners were watched by men shackled to their posts, each party trapped by the fortress's unforgiving architecture and the logic of suspicion. Moreover, the physical constraints imposed on guards impacted their effectiveness. With limited mobility, their ability to respond quickly to disturbances or attempts at escape was hampered. This vulnerability was a gamble castle authorities accepted to reduce the risk of betrayal. It highlights the trade-offs medieval administrators made between trust, control, and security in a world where deception was a constant threat. The chained watchtower also raises questions about the human cost of such systems. Guards, often common men pressed into service, bore the burden of physical restraint and mental strain alongside the prisoners. Their experience underscores a shared suffering within the medieval penal system, one that blurred the lines between captor and captive, authority and subjugation. Today, remnants of these chained guard posts survive as haunting relics in historical sites and museums. They invite reflection on the brutal pragmatism of past justice systems and the enduring struggle to balance power with trust. The watchtower where guards were chained stands as a stark reminder that imprisonment is not always a one-way street, and that control sometimes requires mutual bondage. In contemplating this dark chapter, we glimpse the vulnerability of all who live under suspicion and constraint, whether prisoner or guard. The chains that bound these men were physical and symbolic, embodying the pervasive mistrust that shaped medieval incarceration. Their story calls us to consider how systems of control impact everyone within them, and how the walls designed to enforce order can trap the souls of both the watched and the watchers. Ultimately, the watchtower where guards were chained to is more than a historical curiosity. It is a powerful metaphor for the costs of power exercised without trust, and for the complex human realities hidden behind stone walls and iron bars. It reminds us that in the darkest prisons, freedom is a fragile, contested thing, and that sometimes those meant to enforce captivity find themselves prisoners in their own right. The whispers in the walls of Bodiam Castle. Deep within the ancient stones of Bodiam Castle, a haunting mystery lingers, one woven from whispers that seem to breathe life into cold, silent walls. Prisoners confined within its dungeons long ago spoke of eerie voices carried through the stone, ghostly murmurs that twisted through the darkness and stirred both fear and madness. What seemed like spectral hauntings were, as modern research reveals, a chilling architectural secret. Tiny ventilation shafts, ingeniously designed, yet inadvertently creating echoes that trapped whispers, turning them into an endless, ghostly chorus. Bodiam Castle, built in the 14th century to defend against invasion during the tumultuous 100 Years' War, was a fortress of stone and shadow. Its dungeons, carved beneath thick walls, housed those accused of treason, debt, and other crimes. In such an oppressive environment, every sound became magnified. A creak of a chain, a distant footstep, and most unsettlingly, whispers that seemed to emerge from the very fabric of the castle itself. Prisoners recounted how voices would echo through the cells, sometimes indistinct, sometimes unmistakably clear, fragments of conversation, mournful sighs, or urgent warnings. These sounds, echoing relentlessly, blurred the line between reality and nightmare, fueling stories of restless spirits trapped within the walls. Some believed the castle was alive, its stones absorbing human suffering and replaying it endlessly. A supernatural reminder of past torments. For centuries, these whispers remained unexplained, dismissed by some as madness brought on by isolation and despair. Yet modern architectural studies have uncovered a different truth, rooted not in the supernatural, but in the cunning design of medieval fortifications. Researchers discovered that Bodiam Castle's ventilation system included a network of narrow shafts running through the walls and chambers, intended to provide fresh air and prevent the buildup of deadly gases in the cramped dungeons below. However, the shape and placement of these shafts created a unique acoustic phenomenon. Sounds entering one shaft could travel and resonate within others, creating overlapping echoes and distortions. Whispers spoken in one part of the dungeon would bounce back through the stone corridors, amplified and multiplied until they filled the cell with an eerie chorus. The effect was disorienting, voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a continuous symphony of silence and sound. This unintended acoustic design likely intensified the psychological torment of prisoners already suffering in darkness and confinement. The persistent whispers could confuse and frighten, making it difficult to distinguish reality from hallucination. In some cases, the echoes might have served as unintentional warnings, carrying sounds of approaching guards or distant footsteps, yet more often they deepened the prisoner's sense of isolation and despair. Bodiam Castle's whispers are a stark reminder of how architecture itself can influence human experience, turning stone and air into instruments of psychological pressure. These echoes, born from necessity to keep air flowing, became a cruel, unintended punishment, an auditory prison within the physical one. Today, visitors to Bodiam Castle often remark on the stillness of the stone halls. Yet beneath that silence lies the memory of voices once trapped and twisted by design. The whispers in the walls continue to captivate historians and sound engineers alike, blending history with mystery in a haunting echo of lives once confined. In the end, the story of Bodiam's whispering walls is both a testament to medieval ingenuity and a chilling chapter in the history of imprisonment, where the very stones seem to speak, carrying the voices of the past through time, as a ghostly chorus born not of spirits, but of stone, shadow, and sound.